I guess like starting at a super high level, like when you look at agentic AI, what first principles and or primitives do you think it dominantly breaks in terms of how we've traditionally done IAM? Like why?
Being somebody that's kind of built a lot of the OAuth stack out at companies and in the standards bodies, that open world shift, for example, is not what OAuth was originally designed to solve. It was more of a closed world model, and when you start breaking some of those assumptions, the protocol stack starts breaking. This idea of like, you're not just giving it credentials, you're giving it powers, and you want to have a way to limit what those powers are.
You probably saw the news, it was last week or the week before, the Pocket OS incident, right, where the agent essentially was trying to achieve its objective and or goal, and it found credential and essentially utilized it, and then of course like violated its system prompt, etc.
How can we develop enough safety controls so that the blast radius is survivable even if the initial sort of mandate or mission is not 100% correct?
What's the most dangerous thing teams are doing right now to bridge that gap?
It's, again, things that we know about, but we got to be more forceful in this new model.
Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Karl McGinnis. Karl, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. I said that before we went on air here, your blogs and kind of your thought leadership around IAM and agentic AI have been making my head spin. But for folks that don't know you, don't know your kind of thought leadership in this domain and what you've been up to throughout your career, can you give us a bit of a background?
Yeah, sure, no problem, man. I was previously chief product architect at Okta for I was there for 11 years. Started early days startup, grew the company to the large company it is today. And before Okta, I've been different roles in identity my entire career. I did identity in healthcare, did it in infrastructure, dating all the way back to sort of the early late 90s. So identity is my game. I've been doing it and did it in different capacities as engineer, product leader, architect, executive. So I've seen it from different lenses. And Okta was a first class seat to sort of cloud identity becoming core as the identity cloud and core infrastructure was sort of kind of came about during the Okta era.
That's awesome. So I know you talked about kind of taking some time and going back to first principles, and folks who are reading your work, I'm sure, can pick up on the primitives you're talking about throughout the pieces. But I guess like starting at a super high level, like when you look at agentic AI, what first principles and or primitives do you think it dominantly breaks in terms of how we've traditionally done IAM? Like why is it so fundamentally different from your perspective?
Yeah, great opening. So that's kind of some of the root questions I just started with, which is having built large scale identity platforms that solved traditional enterprise access management, identity governance, privileged account management. I kind of know what those systems are sort of purpose built to go solve for, and sort of the gaps they have. And when you look at agentic outcomes, the first thing is really kind of the framing that I have is really around closed and open world. So a lot of our modeling today of software interacting with other software is a closed world architecture, where you can predefine the paths the software takes, you can model the permissions and actions, you can model the risk, you can put policies in place, you put lifecycle governance, credential lifecycle, credential vaulting. These are the standard technologies that customers may know of today. Is rooted around sort of a closed world model. And so when you think about agents with an open world model, where they discover at runtime based on intent what they want to connect to, and then need to dynamically connect to downstream resources, and how does that start shifting a bit of how we model our IAM infrastructure was sort of the first kind of area. And so being somebody that's kind of built a lot of the OAuth stack out at companies and in the standards bodies, that open world shift, for example, is not what OAuth was originally designed to solve. It was more of a closed world model. And when you start breaking some of those assumptions, the protocol stack starts breaking. So as we start looking at open world, the next problem really is starting to think about, when I was looking at sort of the four domains of identity, was like there's the core identity layer, who is acting. Then there's sort of the access. May this this request proceed? It's sort of a request time kind of modeling. Delegation is what can this actor do on behalf of another? And a lot of our systems that we've deployed historically can model those somewhat to some degree. I know we have great primitives for modeling identity. Our governance and lifecycle actions there have been built out over many years. Access has been the focus to me of really the last decade, was really the zero trust, really rethinking some of the core primitives around the access modeling, and a lot of investment has been on that side of the house. Delegation was kind of a little bit there. OAuth has a delegation model, but we really didn't spend a lot in our infrastructure to really formally model delegation. A lot of times that was modeled through our IGA processes and human level approvals. But the area that was really missing to me was authority, which is if you really take a step back and think about what you're going to try to do with agents to drive the end-to-end outcomes in an open world model, is you don't really want to just take credentials, vault credentials in a vault that have predefined permissions assigned to those credentials, and then give it access to those credentials to interact in an open world. What you're really trying to model, I think, is really more around authority, which is how do I grant authority for the agent to act in a bounded context? And how does that context and bound work across a series of different types of boundaries and hops? And that was really the core IAM like layer to me that I started to kind of dig into, is like, well, where does authority exist? How does it work? It doesn't really exist today in your IDP. It doesn't really exist today in your IGA or your PAM products. We don't really have a way to model that. And how does authority get described and enforced over time? And that was kind of, I think a lot of the early writing was just kind of starting to think through some of that shift from open world and really thinking about this gap around authority, and then kind of building on top of that.
So you've covered a hell of a lot right there. So I'm probably going to hit on each of these, like
Sure.
many of those things as we go along. But I've kind of pulled some things from various blogs and pieces that you had and things that I was reading and so on. So like you talk about a structural gap. I think you've argued that agentic IAM problem can't be closed with like stronger credentials, tighter scopes, and faster JIT provisioning. Why not? Like, what is the structural property of human-paced IAM that disappears when an agent's in the loop?
Yeah, so a lot of those are request-bound controls or session-bound controls. And so it's centered around sort of the human and the request or the token. And there's nothing that sort of binds it across a series of calls that are independent, that are all related to a task or an intent or a purpose of what you're trying to go solve. And so those systems are built and are useful for what they do, but they can't construct the original intent and be able to enforce that intent over time. And the over time part is, I think, the sort of core change here is that sort of, what do I want to say here? The challenge is that you can have an open-ended task to go accomplish something. I want to assign my agent the ability to go research a bunch of flights, book a vacation. So at some point in time, I may want to change the scope of what it can do over time. And so that requires some durable system that can own what that authority is and control the revocation, control the attenuation of it. Where I think a lot of what we have today is really sort of token bound systems that sort of do controls that sort of request time or model sort of a human interactive session kind of concepts. And so there's no idea of like, I close the laptop, session's over, or I log out. Those kinds of concepts don't map easily to sort of long running autonomous agents. So presence and pacing, are main aspects of sort of a human driven use case. And sort of those kind of change, I think, a bit when we move to Agentic.
Yeah, I definitely think so. Another thing that you use analogies in your writing in some way.
Yeah, I try to at least. That's sort of just comes from some experience, which is like you can get super deep in the tech, and that's awesome. But when you start communicating more broadly across a large organization, you kind of need to find some good analogies to get folks to sort of grok sort of what you're.
No, it's super helpful, even for myself, who's been in cyber for 20 years. Like the analogies are helpful to kind of frame how to think about it. And one of them was, power of attorney over passports, I think is how you framed it. Yeah. But it reframes agent identity as like delegated authority rather than credentials. And like, for a CISO who's listening right now, like has spent the last decade investing in IGA and PAM and Federation, like what does it actually mean operationally to issue, kind of a mandate instead of a credential? And where does that sit relative to like today's IDPs?
Yeah, so that's kind of another series in a post I was really looking at is first identifying the problem using the power of attorney analogy. And that was really just a way to, it's not, analogies are never perfect. So there's definitely gaps, but this idea of like, you're not just giving it credentials, you're giving it powers, and you want to have a way to limit what those powers are. And like today we have an example of how that might work. Like there's a power of attorney, you can have a medical, you could have a state. And so you're giving it the ability to act in these powers where you're not present, and there's constraints upon it, right? And it's a mandate or a contract or something that can be enforced when you're not present, right? And those are sort of some of the interesting properties that I was looking at, which was like, how do we specify that? How do you then enforce that over a series of enforcement points? And there's, challenges in how to make that architecture exist. So the first example was, how do I construct, what these powers are based on an intent? And that was sort of this idea of what I called mission and mission shaping as a concept, which was interesting because I think the challenge here is the power of attorney analogy requires, that's the enforceable mandate part of the problem statement. But I first have to start with sort of constructing what my mission is. What am I trying to accomplish, to then turn it into a mandate that's enforceable? And that gets into sort of a semantic layer that I started to try to dig into, which is a lot of folks are circling around today, which is, how do I take intent from a semantic perspective, turn that into something that is more of a mandate, and have that mandate enforced over time? And if I start modeling those things out, where does that exist in the architecture? So back to your original question, is that I think this is a net new control plane that sits above what you have today. So you have your IDPs, your IGAs, your PAMs, and I think there's sort of a net new control plane that we're kind of circling around in the industry that's going to end up layering across those, that provides this authority layer. And so some of the things it may do is it may be involved in the shaping of what a mission is. It may be an area that stores the governance of what it was approved, and then have a control plane to be able to send signals, attenuate that across a set of different systems, and give the ability for somebody to go back from an audit perspective to determine, is the action that is in place still a part of the approved mission. And so there's some protocol gaps. There's some control plane that we're trying to get to. There's going to be probably multiple different protocols to plug into that control plane. So that's kind of some of what I was trying to tease out, is that like, I don't think what you have today is going to go away, but I do think we're getting to a new control plane for authority that's going to layer above that, that's going to own a bit of where some of this gets modeled. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, no, it does. It's funny you answered it that way, because I was going to ask, like, most enforcement today happens at the gate, like token issuance, policy evaluation at request time. You've been arguing for like runtime governance and continuous evaluation, and I was going to ask, what does that look like in the stack? And I think you're essentially saying it's going to be a net new, as you said, net new control plane that functions at capacity.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a nature of just how this thing works, is it's going to be distributed. There's a cross-domain sets of challenges with agents, right? So we know better how to deploy and manage single domain systems. So, I have my trust domain, I have my root, I have a set of controls in place, I understand how lifecycle works, I have a policy enforcement point, I own the policy, I own all the outcomes. When you start going across trust domains, it starts getting much more interesting and much more challenging. And that's, I think, an area today where we don't have a lot of operational experience at scale in our enterprises of doing that, because we kind of like our single trust domains as best as possible. We do some level of federation, but the federation really isn't a multi-party federation where the rules of engagement are defined up front, and at runtime you dynamically join federations. They're sort of point-to-point federations that have been established for integration. So this control plane is going to have privacy concerns when you start crossing the domains. It's going to have a bunch of security issues, cryptographic binding scenarios to do the provenance, to know that, hey, it wasn't modified anywhere in it. And then just from an architectural perspective, you get into just distributed systems problems, which is like, how much of this can be defined in an interoperable, cryptographic model? How much of this is going to have to get distributed, whether it's, revocations or state getting distributed across boundaries, and so you're like pub subs and, pushing and pulling and things that we've looked at before on the internet scale problems. I don't think any of that kind of goes away. I think we build on a lot of those, and we figure out the right pieces we need. But I was really just trying to get alignment in the industry of like, where are we going? Because what I saw was a lot of folks sort of just starting from ground zero of just building a complete new stack. and not really aligning on sort of what are maybe some of the roles, functions, what is the control plane needing to do. And so if we get better alignment on a little bit more of that sort of higher level product architecture vision, I think we can start better defining like what are the priorities, what are the gaps, what are the protocols that we may need to evolve, what is the pro con of evolving an existing protocol versus a net new purpose-built protocol. Those would be just coming back to being in the product game forever and building products at scale for global companies. Like that's just my mindset. It's just how to think of this more from a roadmap and conversation versus like just go off and start building brand new protocol stacks. So that was kind of like kind of a little bit of where I was coming from in some of those posts.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna take us into the protocol piece. I want to ask like maybe a practical example. I think you probably saw the news. It was last week or the week before, the Pocket OS incident, right, where the agent, and I'm not sure if you saw this, but the agent, essentially was trying to achieve its objective and or goal, and it found a credential and essentially utilized it, and then of course like violated its system prompt, et cetera. But that kind of touches on like your runtime governance that you've been talking about. Knowing, like I've worked in large enterprises most of my career, as you have, and it's like there's so many orphan credentials, overly permissive accounts, like all these types of things that are just sitting around, and the agents are going to ultimately make use of them, I imagine. Like how do you see us governing or securing that given that they compile this at runtime, their context and so on?
Yeah, it's a kind of that's rubber meets the road. I think where a lot of organizations are today, which is the human authority of how it was done today, of all these credentials and the risk of it. Like organizations already had all these problems today, but it was sort of, I wouldn't say managed, but it was accepted to a certain risk level, just because of the scale of how fast a human could potentially make decisions on which tokens to use and sort of the blast radius of them. And so when we start changing sort of the blast radius and the scale and the time vectors, we need to rethink some of how we go about solving this. And so I think right now the industry is kind of, I think, lining on a two-pronged approach. One first is this sort of mission shaping governance, intent modeling. How can you better take what the human is trying to do and determine a model around that of what are the approved things that thing should be interacting with? And turning that into some level of a mandate or a runtime set of instructions that are enforced, which is like your sandboxing. It's going to be a little bit of your tokens and scopes and permissions that are used. And there's some, approval and human in the loop. And some of those components are all at the sort of shaping level of like, what should this thing do? And is it approved for what sets of constraints? But the part that we need to also not lose sight of is that because of this semantic gap, because obviously we're dealing with agents and LLMs that are that are probabilistic, and there's always the poisoning or tainting of context or attacks with changing the LLM prompts or missions. We need a containment strategy, and so I was using the term survivable incorrectness as sort of the modeling there, which is how can we develop enough safety controls so that the blast radius is survivable, even if the initial sort of mandate or mission is not 100% correct. So we kind of have to look at this as a two-pronged kind of solution, which is we're not going to be able to solve it all by pre-processing or having the LLM make some decisions or putting in some security products post-LLM or filterings or containments or sandboxes, all that stuff we need. But at the end of the day, we're also going to need to really think heavily about sort of the blast radius aspect of survivable incorrectness and what's the right way to ensure that when mistakes do happen, what's the kill switch or what's the right way that we can sort of back out and limit the damage and learn from it and refine as we go. And I think you have to take a realistic approach to those where we may be right now, CISOs may be investing a little bit more into sort of the survivable incorrectness piece because the trust in the stack and some of the components that are needed to really scale the governance piece and the mandate pieces aren't really there yet. So
yeah,
I think it's going to evolve a little bit on both sides, and it's going to kind of need both to kind of get us to where we want to get to.
No, I love the framing of the survivable incorrectness and dealing with the blast radius and kind of preparing to be resilient essentially because we can't control everything. I was going to ask you, like you've written a lot about AAuth and OAuth and now Dick Hart's AAuth draft now has a mission layer. I suspect heavily influenced by your writing and leadership on this. Is AAuth the protocol that agentic identity should bet on? You think, or is it OAuth extended with ACT? And like, how do you think about the protocol ecosystem? Because it seems like there's kind of multiple concurrent I don't want to say competing, but concurrent, disparate efforts underway. Where do you see it all going, I
Yeah, great
guess?
question. So this is again related to sort of the core of what the writing was getting to, which is like once I sort of got clarity on sort of this open world problem, the clarity on this idea of power of attorney and authority and where does it live in an architecture, I went down the route of like, hey, what does it take to make OAuth solve this? And there's a lot of challenges to do that. And so obviously the next question is going to be, okay, well, what does it mean if you were to start sort of clean with some of these open world concepts baked into the protocol stack? And that was sort of where a lot of where Dick Hart was started with some of his assumptions of being one of the primary authors of OAuth, was realizing similar in his own point of view, sort of where some of the gaps were. But the substrate layer of just making some of the open world concepts work without really having a clear answer for some of the scaling of the authority piece or the mission piece was the initial sort of gap that I saw on the AOS side. And so I worked with Dick to sort of help make the case that if you're going to build a net new protocol for Agentic, that needs to be baked into the core design. It can't just be sort of bolted on later. And he came around to that and sort of resolved some of those gaps and did a good job, I think, of taking the pieces from it that made sense for his design goals, pull some of that into scope. And so I think AOauth is interesting, but it's also unproven at scale, right? It's sort of a net new initiative. And so I think AOauth is an interesting protocol that folks should be watching, they should be experimenting, they should be engaging with, because it gives us a sort of clean room to sort of explore a lot of these problems. But I think organizations need to evolve also what they have. And so I'm investing a lot right now of time in introducing OAuth extensions that sort of interest towards that mission-bound open world approach. And so I'm closing some of the security gaps in OAuth with some additional specs. I just published some drafts, individual drafts, not working groups drafts yet, around sort of modeling agents as actors and how does that flow through a bunch of tokens. And so using an area of OAuth that we haven't really defined a lot of areas in over the years because we operated on this implicit delegation model where software acted as a user and software was really this just like, web server. It's all of Google, it's all of Slack, acting on behalf of the user. We didn't really need to define it down to this agent, this instance of an agent, this attestation, this context acting in this capacity across a set of tokens. So kind of just defining some of those gaps right now and working with other folks in the industry to kind of push some of those things forward, because I think some of that can be operationalized in a shorter time with some of the OAuth infrastructure they have now. And then at the same time, I think some of this authority pieces can be layered outside of OAuth, right? And so I think some of this doesn't necessarily always have to be inside the protocol. We might need a few pieces to tie it together, but how can you take a prompt, send it through, get a mission, approve the mission, bind that to approval, and then have those approvals be orchestrated by using orchestration layers into your existing access management products, right? And so you can potentially, maybe for a set of use cases, that could be okay. You get some level of visibility, you're starting to integrate around it. So I'm still working on the crawl, walk, run of how organizations can kind of take some of these ideas and put them into practice today. What are the short-term OAuth extensions that we should be focusing on to kind of move us there, while we work with Dick Hart and other folks that are building sort of clean room protocols that are purpose-built. And I'm just kind of, working with them closely to make sure we're collaborating and evolving to a common goal. And so I'm excited about that work. I'm also excited to work with some of the companies I'm working with on more of the shorter term, how do we make some of the OAuth stuff work?
Yeah, I really like the aspect of not making perfect enemy of good, in the sense of you're working on utilizing what exists today while still trying to build for the future. And I feel like sometimes we get so hung up on well, what about this or what about that? It's you're just trying to make things functional and usable, plausible for now while we still build towards where we're headed. You mentioned delegation, and I've seen some folks arguing that delegation is the real identity problem in agentic AI, in terms of who exactly is acting on behalf, on whose behalf. What was the original intent? How does intent survive delegation? Sub agents, ephemeral agents. How do you think of those? That kind of
and so that's in the middle of where we've been discussing a lot of this stuff, which is at the higher level you have some of these analogies and some of these systems, but at the sort of mechanical level of how these things work, you can't just take the existing off the shelf OAuth stack and have it solve all these problems. And so that's where kind of initially folks, just to get going, they want to leverage, hey, all this stuff exists in the enterprise. I don't want to rebuild auth. I don't want to rebuild these systems. So how can I just take what's there and go? And we did that, right? We did that with MCP. We did that where we just took what was already deployed and tried to make it work for the use cases. And now we're running into the next level of problems, which is, wait a minute, how does the agents do get all these tokens? What happens when they spin up a sub agents? Do they just reuse the super token, or do they start getting more scope tokens? How does a lot of those gaps are being discussed in lots of different communities, and we're sort of aligning on a set of gaps and primitives, which is, how do we take lessons learned from workload identity, which is really this, attestation, dynamically issued credentials about the identity based on, what is presented as evidence to then become, I am this workload, and I am dynamically given keys that then can be used to then interact with other systems. So you have an IDP type model for it, right? So okay, cool. We love that model. There's a lot of value in having an agent IDP. Okay, so now we have an agent IDP concept. It's going to have to get represented in probably different ways. There's probably ways that model really, really, really close to workloads. There's other areas where we may need it to be its own on-device IDP that ends up issuing, sub-agents from its own device context, right? Okay, and then how do we start mapping some of the identity layer of who it is, what are the keys, how do you pass the keys, how do you bind the keys? We're getting into like protocol level now gaps of like some of those things, and that's where I mentioned there's some OAuth extensions there. There's folks looking at like attenuation and delegation of the same token on the same host, crossing boundaries to an authorization server. You got this like trust boundary layer, then going from there to multiple different trust boundaries. So I think folks are going to get more success in the shorter term, like I said, on sort of single domain. And then we start getting into these multi-domain trust domain problem statements. It's going to get a little bit harder to evolve everybody at the same time. And so, I mean, as long as you can tie all that into your same policy engine, you can tie all that into your same, dictate your same sets of claims. But there's gaps that we haven't solved. For example, is what is going to be the right token format or the right cryptographic mechanism that we're going to use to attenuate. Lots of ideas out there, lots of prior art. That stuff comes over implementation in time. It's very hard to just upfront just pick the winner because there's trade-offs across the board. The trade-offs from performance, trade-offs from deployability, trade-offs from, and that's where we're at, is more experience. I think 2026 has sort of been the year where folks have really started to deploy agents. You could argue that last year was more theoretical. This year, more organizations have real-world deployments. And that's where you're starting to see some of this stuff come out. And then that feedbacks into working groups, it feedbacks into conferences and discussions. And so that's kind of mapping that all in. And so that's kind of why I wanted to start with more of that higher level first principle view of like, what are we marching towards? So we can keep the conversation moving at the right level and not just get lost a little bit in bike shedding a bunch of different details that may not be where we need to align on right now, because some of that stuff is just going to be the best deployed, the best implementation that it has the highest value, that's easiest to adopt, is going to drive a lot.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of round us out with maybe a last question here for you, in the sense of like a practitioner oriented one. Like a lot of what you're talking about and what we've discussed lives in like IETF drafts or architectural essays, blogs, dialogue in the industry. Meanwhile, like security teams have agents, as you pointed out, running in production today. Vendors are selling quote unquote agentic IAM at RSA and other conferences.
Yep.
Like, what's the most dangerous thing teams are doing right now to bridge that gap, and what's the minimum viable posture you'd recommend, like while the standards kind of codify?
Right. So I think where folks are today is, I think there's a bunch of tactical work folks can be doing. And so this comes back to, I think, some of the, we just saw the Vercel attack that just happened. I think right now it's just like federating OAuth starts opening up a lot of possibilities. So today we operate in a world of these OAuth islands where all the credentials are on the, have to be registered. Every client has to be registered. You end up vaulting all these credentials. You end up having to then, because you have to delegate on behalf of a user using an OAuth flow that has to happen in an interactive flow that then you grab the tokens, store them in your vault, and reuse them, right? So what is you're going to do with an agent? You're going to do an OAuth flow, capture the tokens, store them somewhere, and then let your agent act on behalf of those tokens, right? And so I think the most shortest term work is really just starting to get clarity of like, how can we start moving to federation models where I can take the sort of assertion that this is this agent acting on behalf of this user and pass it across a boundary and have it say, okay, now I can issue you a token at runtime to do something, and I don't need it to be vaulted. So that moves to that kind of like IDP like architecture. Because once you start decoupling that, then we can start looking at, okay, well, how do we start making sure that continuity for auditing and it's the same agent across both the hops, and we can start getting traceability. We can start then starting to figure out where can we put common policy across these things. I think it becomes really hard to make a lot of progress when we're still at this sort of everybody's got to go get all these OAuth tokens and vault them when you want to act on behalf of a user. We have all these patterns today for workloads, but we haven't really reached a lot of critical mass deployment today of how to do it for delegated OAuth. So I think that's just like one area that's just I'm pretty strong point of view on. It's just like it's been something we've been needed to do for 10 years, and I think now is the time where we need to start pushing our vendors, pushing our implementations to start federating the user delegation layer, and then obviously this is just your best practice. And then you start thinking about those long-lived tokens and the standing permissions, and this is sort of like your existing identity roadmap needs to get mature and higher capabilities on how you've handled a lot of these things today that you might have not have prioritized. And then where you start thinking about your first set of Agentic deployments, I think it's really starting to think about, if you're looking at AWS, you're looking at Azure, you're looking at your primary cloud vendors probably as some of your areas where you're building and deploying things around. They have a lot of good primitives in there, and they're starting to integrate around these things. And I think it's just starting to get a reference architecture for where you're going to be this year, where you're going to be next year. There's work happening in NIST to start aligning on this like common architecture of like how do we think about agentic architectures. And so it's not that different than how like zero trust and these other things started off, right? Which is like everyone read a Beyond Court paper and was like, yes, that's the answer for everything. Then it was like, oh crap, what do we do? And then you need the next level, the next level, the next level, right? And so there's a bunch of stuff, like I said, of like get your house in order. There's a bunch of controls and things that you can move more towards. I think there are some more practical steps we need to do to open up federation capabilities, because that decouples a lot of effort. And then I think there's going to be a lot of work at the sort of reference architecture levels of like what pieces are in place. And then that enables the analysts, it enables the research, the vendors, everybody to sort of start talking about these in best practices and architecture deployment models. And, I'm just pattern match into how I saw this stuff play out for the zero trust here. I think we're going to have another 10 years of what zero trust was at RSA is going to be Agentic, and it's going to, keep getting refined. You're going to have more and more people speaking about real world best practices that they actually got out of this stuff. And then in it, you're going to start seeing patterns in interoperability. It's like these components can be deployed in these ways to get these types of outcomes, right? So right now it's a little bit hard just because the world moves so quickly, and now we're in May, so 5 months, right? Since sort of the big shift over Christmas of agentic coding being a real thing. It's just going to keep accelerating. And I think the hard part as a CISO is really just going to be keeping that momentum up at a high pace where every 6 months it's going to look completely different. But I think getting clarity on that governance layer and how to enable teams to start, where are your, controls today from survivable correctness? Where can we start getting, again, don't deploy agents as service accounts. Don't deploy agents with static credentials. Start moving, like it's again, things that we know about, but we got to be more forceful in this new model instead of just trying to say, well, I kind of have this old service account model around. Let me just model every agent as a service account.
Yeah, I think what you said there jumped out to me among many other things was, CISO is trying to keep pace and just staying informed and, kind of in the loop on this, as well as thinking forward of how to do things without kind of replicating what we've done in the past. And, I'll close this with the fact that you have an excellent blog. It's called Control Plane by Karl McGinnis, and its subtitle is Identity as Infrastructure. And I think you've made a hell of a case that, that's a great framing here when it comes to the world of agentic AI. So Karl, thanks so much. I've learned a lot from your blogs and appreciate you coming on the chat, and look forward to kind of following your thought leadership in this domain moving forward still.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate you inviting me. It was a fun chat.
Absolutely. Take care.